Hey, what's up you guys? Thanks for joining me. Today, we're going to be discussing the murder of Grace Packer. This case falls into our Fostered series, and like the others, it's very disturbing. If you've seen my Logan Marr video, this one is eerily similar in many ways. I just want to give a warning, we're going to be talking about child abuse as well as sexual assault. A lot of it is very graphic and hard to hear, so if you're sensitive, you might want to check out one of my other videos.
Before we get started, do me a favor and subscribe. It's free, it only takes a second, and it really helps me continue to do these videos. Also, be sure to click the notification bell to keep up with all of my future uploads. Alright, let's get back to it.
Grace was born on August 14th, 2001 to Rose and Rodney Hunsaker, and they lived in Reading, Pennsylvania. The Hunsakers were young parents, and Rose was only 15 years old when she gave birth to her first daughter. She gave birth to Grace when she was only 18. Grace's name given to her at birth was actually Susan, which was obviously later changed. For the sake of avoiding any confusion, I'm going to be referring to her as Grace throughout the video. So, Grace was actually 2 months premature, and she weighed in at just 4 pounds, 5 ounces at birth. Rose says that she was so small that she was able to dress her in doll clothes. Rose adored her children, and even went on to have a son when Grace was 2 years old. Sadly though, she was battling some pretty severe mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder and severe anxiety. She struggled to maintain her medication, and Rose and Rodney both struggled with intellectual challenges also. And because of this, the Berks County Children and Youth Services stepped in. They didn't believe that the Hunsakers were able to provide a safe environment for the children. The children were ultimately removed from the home and placed into foster care in February of 2004. Initially, all 3 of the children were placed together with a family that actually wanted to adopt them. But they eventually grew tired of the system and just gave up. In October of 2004, Grace and her younger brother Josh went to live with the Packers, while the oldest Hunsaker child went to live with another family. Rose attempted to work with CYS to get her children back. However, that never happened. The Hunsakers got an attorney that later stated they were a very nice couple, and they truly did everything in their power to change their living conditions. However, they weren't able to afford financially what the state was demanding. The only housing they were able to afford was a 1-room apartment in Reading, which just didn't do it, unfortunately. Ultimately, the judge ruled against the Hunsakers after a psychologist examined them and testified against them. When their attorney broke the news to them, they didn't quite grasp what was even happening. They thought that they would eventually get their children back. The attorney ultimately had to tell them they were never getting their children back. And he found it so upsetting that he had to take the rest of the day off from work. They really had the best intentions. At first, Rose would visit the children 3 times a week at a supervised center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And ultimately, that's where she first met a woman named Sara Packer. Rose said that Sara gave her a great first impression. Apparently, she was always dressed very professionally, and the kids seemed happy with her. Rose really believed that her children were being well cared for, especially because Sara had been working for the Northampton County Children, Youth, and Families Division since 2003. Rose was truly heartbroken after losing her children, but believed that the system and Sara would be able to give them a better life. She recalls that the last time she saw Grace, one of the workers told her that it was time to say goodbye. She actually refused to say it because she said goodbye was forever, and she really believed that she would see Grace again, even if it wasn't until she was grown. In May of 2005, Sara and her husband David began the process of adoption. They actually adopted them through an agency called the Impact Project. So, the Impact Project states on their website that they're a private children and youth agency. They were established in 1991 and apparently offer programs for youth that are placed in foster care through juvenile probation, as well as children and youth offices from all over Pennsylvania and Delaware. When they began the adoption process, the Packers legally changed Grace's name, obviously from Susan to Grace. I'm not sure what Josh's name was prior, but it was changed as well. Can I just say something? I feel weirdly conflicted with adoptive parents changing their children's names. I actually decided to research this a little bit and was surprised to discover it's actually really common. And there are a lot of pros and cons, but I just can't help but find it a little bit odd, especially when they're old enough to know their previous names, like in the Edward and Austin Bryant case. Either way, from 2005 forward, the kids went by Grace and Josh Packer. Also, I'd like to make a note that because Grace had a severe learning disability, she was considered to be a special needs child. Of course, because of this, the Packers would continue to receive adoption subsidies for Grace's care, despite her being adopted. They were collecting over $700 a month just for Grace's care. But they didn't stop there. Over the course of 10 years, the Packers fostered over 30 children and collected benefits on every single one of them. Sadly, this wasn't the worst thing about this family. Sometime during 2006, David Packer, Grace's adoptive father, began sexually abusing Grace, who by this time was only 4 or 5 years old. In June of that year, the Hunsikers' parental rights were officially terminated. Jumping forward a little bit to March of 2007, Berks County approved the adoption of Grace and Josh, so they were officially Sara and David's children. In October of 2007, Sara was promoted to a supervisor role at her work, just like the Logan Marr case. The following year, so in May of 2008, the state's welfare department launched an investigation after receiving a report from another foster child that was living in that home. They claimed that David Packer was abusing Grace. However, they apparently didn't find any signs of abuse or just didn't take the allegations seriously because no charges were filed. I can imagine that when they investigated, the caseworker probably spoke with Sara, who was also a social worker and probably knew how to manipulate them. Who would a social worker believe? Another social worker or some troubled teen that was in and out of the foster system? Nothing ever came of that report at that time. In June of 2009, the Packers became permanent legal custodians of another child. Fast forwarding a little bit, in January of 2010, the Lehigh County authorities initiated another investigation into David Packer after more claims of sexual abuse, and ultimately he gets arrested. Thank God. But this wouldn't be the last of Grace's trouble. Immediately following this, Sara was placed on leave from her job and then was terminated due to misconduct. David was then charged with indecent assault of a child under 13. Which I would assume is Grace given the previous allegations. So as they're going through the investigation and court process, the investigators end up charging David with another count of indecent assault of a child. This time on a child under 16. This charge was in regards to another foster daughter that the Packers had in their home, which I'll get to in a minute. So David ends up pleading guilty to the indecent assault for the first case and statutory sexual assault for the second. He was sentenced to 18 months to up to 5 years in prison and would obviously be obligated to register as a sex offender. He actually ended up serving about 4 years. At that point in time, Sara wasn't charged, but it was indicated that she was involved in the case. Basically what that means is she'll be placed on something called Childline. So Childline is a division of the Pennsylvania DHS, and it's basically a clearinghouse for people involved in abuse cases. So basically, this means that she was there, witnessed it, did nothing about it, but was never charged. What David did to the other girl was just nightmarish. She moved into their home in 2008. She was 15 at the time, and David began abusing her shortly after she moved in. She's now an adult and has spoken out about what he did. She stated that David moved her into a bedroom on the 3rd floor, just beside the one he shared with Sara. He would frequently tie her to the bed and leave her there all night. David also forced her to go on a diet to lose weight and then forced her to wear revealing outfits for him. She has no idea how Sara didn't know the abuse was going on. She attempted suicide twice while she was living there and was hospitalized once because of it. So this girl, who was in the foster care system at that time, attempted suicide, was hospitalized, yet not one damn person thought, I wonder if something's going on. You gotta be kidding me. She also went on to say that Sara treated Grace poorly and that she'd yell, scream, and hit her. Basically, Sara was just a big bully. Sadly, other former foster children have come forward with abuse allegations as well. A woman named Crystal came forward that had lived in the Packer home for a few months as a teenager. She says that she got a really weird and eerie vibe from David. One day, she decided to go through his phone and see what she could find. She actually came across photos and videos of him sexually abusing one of the other foster daughters. Thankfully, she immediately told one of her relatives, who got the police involved. She too has said how mean Sara was to Grace, and that it was very obvious that she favored Josh. She said that Grace was always in trouble, and that both Sara and David would hit her, ground her excessively, take her things away from her, and frequently kept her locked in her room. Yet, Grace remained happy and upbeat. Crystal says that Grace was warm and would open her heart up to anyone. A third woman named Jade came forward, and she lived in the home with Sara and David as well. Her circumstances were a little bit different though, because she was either pregnant when she moved in or became pregnant while living there. Being a teen parent was such a scary thought for Jade, and Sara took advantage of that. She actually convinced Jade to put the baby up for adoption and to allow her and David to adopt the baby. Jade initially agreed to this, but thankfully backed out of it because she had a bad gut feeling about it. She knew she would eventually regret it and decided to keep the baby. I guess she had a mother's intuition. Jade has also said that once Sara was watching CSI and casually mentioned that if she ever killed someone, that she would dismember the body and burn the pieces. It made Jade uncomfortable, but she just tried to take it as a joke at the time. I think Sara wanted to kill someone a lot longer than she leads people to believe. So anyway, where we left off, David was arrested and sent to prison. Obviously, Sara was no longer allowed to have foster children in her home. However, both Grace and Josh remained in her care. And yet again, no one checked on them. Given the previous allegations, you would think that they would have been checked up on. However, because they were adopted, that didn't happen. Also, after David was arrested, Sara met a polyamorous couple named Katherine Albright and Jacob Sullivan, and she began a relationship with both of them in 2013. In June of 2013, Sara sent Grace to a place called Warwick House. According to their website, Warwick House is an intensive, family-focused residential treatment program that serves children ages 5 to 14 years old. While there, Grace started the 7th grade and remained there until December of 2013. The school actually called David's parents just after Christmas. They were concerned because no one came to check out Grace or visit her for the holiday. David's parents went to visit her immediately. And I have to say, they seem very genuine to me. In all of this, they were the only ones to not make excuses for their son's behavior. When Sara found out that Grace's parents had visited her, she pulled Grace out of Warwick Academy immediately. Grace then finished the 7th grade at Vantage Academy, which is a school that helps special education students. They work in smaller, more structured and nurturing environments to help aid the success of their students. Sara then sent Grace back to Warwick House in July of 2015. And that's where she begins the 8th grade. She remained there until January 15th, 2015. So she had been away from Sara for 6 months and then is sent back to Warwick Academy for another 6 months. Because constant instability is exactly what a child with learning disabilities needs, right? To make it worse, when Grace left the Warwick Academy in January, Sara immediately sent her to live with one of David's cousins in North Carolina. So she's not even pretending to care at this point. Grace finished up the 8th grade in North Carolina and began the 9th grade. She was seemingly thriving there, and she was around people that seemed to really care for her. From the outside looking in, Grace appeared to be really happy, but Sara wouldn't stand for that. In November of 2015, Grace returned to live with Sara in Pennsylvania. And things were about to get much, much worse for little Gracie. That's when Sara and her new boyfriend Jacob began plotting her murder, according to testimony. I don't have a lot of details for the months between November 2015 and July of 2016. However, I could imagine things were pretty unbearable for Grace, especially given what happens next. On July 4th, 2016, Sara, Jacob, Grace, and Josh attended a family picnic. That would be the last time that anyone outside of the Packer home would see her alive. At some point before the 4th of July, Sara had begun asking Jacob to sexually assault Grace. She began putting medication in Grace's food to make her compliant and groggy, in hopes that Jacob would agree to sexually assault her. And rather than do what any normal person would do and immediately leave Sara, or I don't know, tell the police, Jacob eventually went along with it. On July 8th, Sara drugged Grace one more time with over-the-counter medication. She and Jacob then took Grace to a rental home that they owned in Quakertown, Pennsylvania. At that time, they tied her up and gagged her. They then decided to take her into the attic. I don't want to get into a lot of the details in respect for Grace and for the fact that it's pretty gross. So I'm just going to gloss over some of it, but you guys can do your own research. Anyway, once they got into the attic, Jacob punched Grace in the face just before sexually assaulting her. To make matters even worse, Sara was just there watching. Apparently, Grace turned to Sara in hopes to get help. However, Sara just stared at her daughter and said, "I can't help you anymore. This is your life now." Initially, their plan was to keep her in the basement so that Jacob could sexually assault her anytime that he wanted. However, once they actually got there and the initial sexual assault took place, Jacob started to panic and decided that they could no longer let Grace live. He and Sara then put a gag in her mouth, tied her up with zip ties, leaving her to die in a closet in the hot attic. Sara and David returned the next morning around 3 a.m., only to discover that Grace had managed to get out of the zip ties and get the gag out of her mouth. They were literally furious that she didn't die in the heat. Jacob punched Grace in the face again, sexually assaulted her one more time, just before choking her to death. Sara had the audacity to tell the jury later that while this was happening, she held Grace's hand and told her it was okay to go, stating that it seemed to take forever for her to die, but that it was only a couple of minutes. Both Sara and Jacob got off on this. They were using Grace as an unwilling participant in a rape-murder fantasy that they apparently agreed to act out together. That's some sick shit. Once Grace was dead, Sara and Jacob stored her body in the attic in cat litter in attempts to avoid the smell of decomposition. On July 11th, Sara reported Grace missing to the Abington Township Police. She claims that Grace ran away and took $300 with her. I think the police basically took her word for it at the time. However, they requested that Sara submit a photo of Grace to the police department. They were hoping to put it out in order to find her. Sara failed to do so. The detective working the case returned to Sara's home, only to discover that it was vacant on September 7th. By this point, almost 2 months had gone by that Grace was missing. The detective then learned that Grace's brother was enrolled in Quakertown Community Schools, but Grace was not. When they tracked Sara down, they told her that Grace would be entered into the National Database for Missing Persons. That was on October 11th, and at that point, Sara and Jacob began to panic. On October 16th, Sara went to a Tractor Supply store in Richland. And there, she purchased a bow saw and 2 blades. Sara and Jacob used that bow saw to dismember Grace's body, drove her 75 miles away to Luzerne County, and dumped her on the side of the road like trash. Hunters later discovered her remains on Halloween of 2016. On November 11th, Sara was charged in Montgomery County with child endangerment and obstruction of justice. She was arrested at that time and had been in jail for a little over a month when Jacob comes to her rescue and posts her $1,000 bond. She's then released from Montgomery County Prison. On December 30th, Katherine Albright, remember her, the other person in the relationship, calls 911 when she discovers that Jacob's attempting suicide. He was attempting to overdose at the apartment that he shared with Katherine and Sara. While Katherine was dealing with EMTs, Sara too was taking pills and was semi-unconscious. But Katherine figures, the EMTs were just here. I'll just drive her to the ER. Just found that a little weird. But anyway, on January 7th, Jacob woke up out of the coma he was in and told a few of the nurses that he had played a role in Grace's murder. He confessed that Grace was a nightmare child and that they wanted to give her back, but they couldn't afford to live without her benefits. On January 8th, both Jacob and Sara were charged with homicide, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. Additionally, Jacob was charged with rape, and Sara was charged with conspiracy to commit rape. The following month, Sara was hit with yet another charge. She was charged with stealing Social Security benefits and adoption subsidies after Grace's death. In March, both Northampton County and Lehigh County stopped placing children through the Impact Project after learning that the agency allegedly received reports of abuse by Sara Packer more than 10 years before Grace's death. Sara was arraigned and pled not guilty, at which time the Bucks County prosecutors said they may seek the death penalty for her. Jacob also pled not guilty, and they made everyone well aware that they were seeking the death penalty for him as well. Fast forwarding a little bit, in April of 2017, Sara's attorney had a subpoena served at Warwick House for records regarding Grace, at which time they basically said, "F you," and decided not to turn them over. In May, the Human Services Department determined that the Impact Project always followed state regulations and decided to allow them to remain licensed in Pennsylvania. In July of 2017, Rose and Rodney, if you remember they were Grace's biological parents, filed a petition in Montgomery County Court seeking to be the administrators of Grace's estate. At which time David Packer's parents challenged that petition and asked to be named administrators. The court ultimately ruled against each of their requests and appointed an administrator to handle Grace's estate until Sara stood trial. Jumping forward to February of 2019, Jacob Sullivan pled guilty to first-degree murder. Sara had agreed to testify against Jacob, and of course both of them blamed each other. Jacob claims that Sara was grooming him to assault Grace, while Sara claims that she got wrapped up in Jake's fantasy, and that she didn't think she could tell him no without losing him. She also told the jury that she hated Grace and that she found her to be a difficult child who needed to be punished often. She also stated, and I quote, "Grace had become, for a lack of a better word, a non-entity. She just didn't seem to exist anymore. I wanted her to go away." In a statement read in court, Grace's younger brother Josh wrote, "Watch out for all of the kids so that a loss like Grace's loss never happens again. Do your best to help kids that can't help themselves." Josh sounds like a very wise 14-year-old, and I can't imagine the pain he must be feeling. Most recently, on March 28, 2019, it took jurors 12 hours to decide to sentence Jacob to death. His judge, Judge Diane Gibbons, had no issue with their decision, telling Jacob that he had no soul. While she sentenced him to death, his face showed zero emotion. When she thanked the jury for their service, one of the jurors was actually crying as the judge spoke, because the trial was so gruesome and because Jacob Sullivan's crime was so awful. Despite Sara and Jacob claiming that Grace was a nightmare of a child, others say just the opposite. Grace was bright and bubbly, and she loved music. She was a sweetheart and genuinely cared about other people. In school, she loved books and always wanted to read out loud in the class. And she would actually make different voices for each of the characters. Grace was so full of life, and she had so much life to live. She was beautiful inside and out, and the people that were supposed to be taking care of her were nothing but monsters in hiding. Because of Sara's cooperation in Jacob's trial, she did not face the death penalty. On March 29, 2019, Sara Packer pled guilty to 19 different charges, including first-degree murder, rape of a child, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and theft of government funds. Judge Diane Gibbons added 52 to 104 years to Sara's sentence, ensuring she would never leave prison. But that's not all that Sara got. She also got an earful from this judge. She said, quote, "Evil attracts evil. Evil recognizes evil. This is what happens when two evil people with similar evil interests get together. People like Grace Packer die." Judge Gibbons stated that when she read the details of this crime, she wondered how a mother could inflict so much pain on a child. And then she followed up with this, quote, "But then I realized you were never a parent to Grace. You never wanted to be a parent. The use of the word mother out of your mouth is a profanity. The women that you'll be incarcerated with, do you know where a lot of their children are? In foster care. And they go to bed each night hoping and praying their kids aren't with a foster parent like you. You tried to break her, but Grace would not be broken." As she ended what she had to say, she stared at Sara and said, "Grace will stay with me for the rest of my life. You enjoy the state penitentiary for the rest of your life." Okay, can we just acknowledge the fact that this is an amazing judge who said exactly what everyone was thinking? Also, I just wanted to add in a side note. The fact that Jacob Sullivan received the death penalty for this is a very, very big deal. Because in 2015, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf declared a moratorium, which, for those that may not know, is basically a hold on anyone sentenced to death. And no one has been executed in Pennsylvania since 1999. As far as Sara and Jacob's lover Katherine Albright goes, I believe that she was investigated, but police never made an arrest. I'm not saying that she's guilty, given the fact that she was a social worker herself and was very clearly close to Sara and Jacob. I find it hard to believe that she had no idea something was happening or what they were plotting. She is no longer working as a social worker though. I don't know. I don't know that I should feel sorry for her that her life's turned upside down, or if I believe that justice really wasn't served. What do you guys think? Do you think Katherine Albright was in on it, or just an innocent bystander? How do you guys feel about Jacob Sullivan being sentenced to death? Or what's your stance on the death penalty? I'm a little conflicted on it. I don't know, you guys. Do I think justice was served in this case? And do I think that he was guilty? Do I think Sara was guilty? Absolutely. As far as Grace goes, she was clearly a beautiful soul that touched so many people, and she is very missed. Grace's biological parents are completely heartbroken and also enraged after trusting the state. They believe that they were placing their kids in a better environment than they could provide. They have not been reunited with Josh or their oldest daughter, and I believe they have separated since Grace's death. This was a tough case, and frankly, it pissed me off several times when I was researching it. I just don't understand how this continues to happen. How do these people continue to slip through the cracks? How do they have access to children that are already going through enough as it is? How do these people continue to be employed by government agencies? They're supposed to be child advocates, and some of them, though not all, are literal monsters. We should be talking about this more so there's not another story like Grace Packer's. How can we do better? How do we fix this? You guys do me a favor and share Grace's story, because the first step is speaking up about it and admitting there's a problem with the foster care system. That's it for me today, guys. As always, remember the name Kasey Shane. I'm out.